Sadashivasamarambham Charya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Oh my God. Be seated, please. Oh my. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karava Vahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome back. Welcome also to our many students attending these classes regularly online. We continue with our study of chapter 15 of the Uddhava Gita. And in this section, Sri Krishna is teaching varieties of sadhana, spiritual practice. But what's unique about Sri Krishna's approach, in fact, not unique, it's something very fundamental and important to the Hindu tradition, is that he's not saying what is the best sadhana. He is saying two things: which sadhanas are indispensable and which sadhanas are a matter of personal inclination. And just to make that very clear, he gave two sadhanas which are meant for everyone, and that is karma yoga and dhyana meditation. And these are considered preparatory practices, and they are mandatory for all spiritual seekers. Mandatory in the sense that if you skip them, your other spiritual practice will not be fruitful. If you want your spiritual practice to be fruitful, then karma yoga and dhyana meditation are indispensable. Then he gave, and this is what's actually something unique. I mentioned this before, unique to the Bhagavata Purana in particular, in general, and to the Uddhava Gita in particular. What's unique is that Sri Krishna says that for many, the main sadhana, so if karma yoga and dhyana are preparatory, then what's the main practice? And Sri Krishna, surprisingly, gives you two options for the main practice. He says the main practice can be jnana, spiritual, literally means knowledge, but you know that it doesn't mean knowledge in an ordinary sense. It means the discovery of your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, the so-called inner divinity. But then surprisingly, and unlike Bhagavad Gita and elsewhere, Sri Krishna says va. Va is a Sanskrit word for or. Or the alternate is to practice bhakti. And he says that somebody who happens to hear these teachings about me, Sri Krishna says, then if they are so inclined, let them take to the practice of bhakti. And not surprisingly, this is what's significant. I think I mentioned in the prior class that this is not a jnana versus bhakti kind of discussion. There is no jnana. This versus business doesn't belong in spiritual practice, but rather this is an expression of what we called adhikari bheda. We had long discussions on this, that there are different practices which are intended for different individuals according to their inclinations, according to their nature. And then to resolve this versus business, the way Sri Krishna presents bhakti, and I think hopefully we'll get to that those verses today. Let me cut my introduction short so we have enough time to get there. What you will find, bhakti as defined by Sri Krishna ends up in the same place as jnana. That's not common. Usually bhakti is practiced for the sake of going to heaven, for the sake of hanging out in Goloka Vrindavan with Sri Krishna. This is hanging out as the American expression. You get to go to some heavenly domain to be with Sri Krishna. That's not at all how Sri Krishna presents the goal of bhakti. He presents bhakti, and hopefully we'll get to that verse today, he presents bhakti as leading to the same place as jnana leads. If jnana, spiritual wisdom, leads you to discover your true nature as Satchidananda Atma, Sri Krishna says that Satchidananda Atma is my presence in your heart. So to discover your true nature as Atma, Sri Krishna says, I am that Atma. And in this way, he shows how bhakti ends up at exactly the same place as jnana. Okay, that's enough introduction. Let us see these verses for today. Just to introduce this next verse, he wants to differentiate this bhakti and jnana from other practices, in particular rituals. Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, you might know, is highly critical of rituals. And here again, he's going to show that if you are really a yogi, a spiritual practitioner on the path of jnana, on the path of bhakti, then you will not be excessively focused on these rituals. He says, Yadi kuryat pramadena, Yadi kuryat pramadena, yogi karma vigarhitam, yogi karma vigarhitam, yoge naiva daheran ho, yoge naiva daheran ho, nanyat tatra kadachana, nanyat katran. Yadi, suppose yogi, a spiritual practitioner, kuryat, pramadena, accidentally, kuryat, does what? Karma. Does what kind of karma? Vigarhitam, a detestable karma, a papa karma. Simply put, suppose a yogi by mistake commits a sin. Now, in other traditions, not what Sri Krishna is teaching, in other traditions, if you commit a sin, you're supposed to do prayashchitta karma. Prayashchitta, they translate it as expiatory karma. It's like a karma, a rituals that you do to, I don't know how to translate expiate, to pay, not to pay off, to make up for, so to speak, your sin, to somehow compensate for your sin. It's a uniquely religious concept, and it's not unique to Hinduism. I think other religions have similar things. In the Roman Catholic tradition, they have an interesting thing, that is, if you commit a bunch of little sins, you'll end up going to what they call purgatory, which means it's a place in between heaven and hell, and you go there and suffer for a while before you finally go to heaven. And they have a certain formula in this Roman Catholic tradition that if you want to avoid this way station, if you want to go directly to heaven, you should do these particular prayers. And by doing these prayers, you cover up your small sins, and you get an entrance pass directly into heaven. Admit one, it says. Anyway, but the concept is similar. Prayashchitta, you cover for whatever your bad deeds were. In Sanskrit, we call that prayashchitta, but that's ritual. And Sri Krishna says, hey, if you're a spiritual seeker, you should give up all these rituals, including this prayashchitta. Does that mean if you commit sins, it doesn't make any difference? No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying if you commit sins, you respond as a spiritual seeker without resorting to these rituals, which is what he says in the second half. He says, yogena eva, through your own spiritual practice, the hate. You should burn up. Anha means sin. You should account for your sin. You should expiate your sin. You should cover for your sin. Yogena eva, through your very spiritual practice. So if you're on the path of jnana, this is the commentator makes a point here. If you're on the path of jnana, through jnana abhyasa, through continued spiritual study, you will cover for your sin without doing any rituals, without doing prayashchitta. And if you are on a path of bhakti, the commentator says, through nama sankirtana, by chanting the names of God, you will in that way expiate your karmas, expiate your sin, cover for your sins. You need not do these rituals. In fact, you should not do these rituals. He says, na anyat tatra kadachana. There is no other way for a spiritual seeker to cover for the sins. For others, and if they want to do the rituals, fine. But if you are sincerely on the spiritual path, give up these rituals, even this ritual called prayashchitta. And this leads then to the next verse, where he says, Sway sway dhikare yanishta, sway sway dhikare yanishta, saguna parikirtitaha, saguna parikirtina, karmanam jatya shuddhanam, karmanam jatya shuddhanam, anena niyama kritaha, anena niyama kritaha. Sway sway adhikare yanishta. Yanishta, being established. Being established in what? Sway sway adhikare, according to your own adhikara. We just mentioned adhikara bheda. So according to your adhikara, your qualifications, your preparation, your inclination, according to your individual nature, you will be more inclined towards jnana or more inclined towards bhakti. And this is, you won't find Sri Krishna saying it exactly the same way in the Bhagavad Gita. So this is where he says things differently in the Uddhava Gita. So he says, that dedication, either to jnana, spiritual wisdom, or to bhakti, devotion, saha gunaha parikirtitaha. That is considered the guna, that is considered the most preferable thing. And the point, we have to make the connection to the prior verse. When you say something is better or best, you have to say with reference to what? So here the context is compared to rituals, performing your chosen spiritual practice is preferable. That's what he's saying in this first half. And then he says, well, what about dealing with sinful behavior? So in ancient times, pious Hindus followed the mandates of the Vedas, which included the performance of all these rituals. So if you turn away from all the rituals of the Vedas, then the concern is, wouldn't you turn away from the mandates of the Vedas again also? If you give up Vedic rituals, then you give up a Vedic lifestyle. And then you go to the bar and start drinking or something like that, I don't know. But that's a concern. And Sri Krishna addresses that concern here. He says, karmanam jati ashuddhanam. For those karmas which are ashuddha, impure, drinking, alcohol, whatever else it might be. For those karmas which are impure, he says, niyamaha kritaha. There have been rules established, and he actually uses a word used by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras, meaning that it's not only Vedic lifestyle that keeps you out of the bar, so to speak. It's also commitment to your spiritual practice. So here we're getting a threefold division. It's just to make it a little bit more clear. The threefold division is the following the path of jnana, spiritual wisdom, following the path of bhakti, or following the path of going to the bar. So Sri Krishna says that there's no problem. Going to the bar is avoided not only by following Vedic practices, but you also avoid it by following your spiritual path, jnana, bhakti. By the way, what were the two prerequisites for those? For jnana and bhakti, the two prerequisites Sri Krishna has given is karma yoga and dhyana, meditation. And it's in the Yoga Sutras, the source scripture on meditation, where Patanjali himself gives these yamas, the rules, the restrictions. And anena, by the way, this verse has 3 lines, 6 quarters, and it concludes. Anena connects to this next word. Guna dosha vidhanena, sanganam dhyajanechaya, dhyajanechaya. Good. He says, how do you follow these yamas? He says these yamas anena, by these restrictions, guna dosha vidhanena. These restrictions which vidhana establish what is guna, and dosha establish what is the proper karma and what is a harmful karma. It gives you the right path, how to follow the path of dharma, and in this way, sanganam tyajana ichchaya. These restrictions are given in the Yoga Sutras and elsewhere, ichchaya, with the intent of tyajana, with the intent of avoiding, warding off, sanganam, attachment. So attachment to alcohol is what I gave as a silly example before, but attachment to any object of desire. You overcome these desires with the help of karma yoga and with the help of dhyana, meditation, but not exactly meditation. In those Yoga Sutras are found yamas and niyamas, rules about the spiritual lifestyle you should lead. So by abiding with that spiritual lifestyle, you overcome attachments which are an obstacle to spiritual growth. Okay, that concludes the prior topic, which was the relationship between these sadhanas. What is a relationship? He says that bhakti and jnana are the main paths which are supported by karma yoga and dhyana meditation. And these supports are necessary meditation, are necessary sadhanas. Now he's going to shift his attention specifically to the path of bhakti, which is no surprise because the whole of the Bhagavad Gita, the whole of the Bhagavata Purana is a text on bhakti. And the emphasis in the Bhagavad Gita, interesting to compare the two, just at a very superficial level. Sometimes that's helpful, get the simple view. From that overview level, what topic is most emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita? And the answer to that is clear. Karma yoga is the most emphasized topic in the Bhagavad Gita. In the Uddhava Gita, on the other hand, what we're seeing is that the most emphasized topic is not karma yoga, but rather bhakti. That's the difference in context. So that's our next topic, and we continue. Jata Shraddho Matkatasu, Jata Shraddho Matkatashu, Nirvinna Sarva Karmasu, Nirvinna Sarva Karmasu, Veda Dukkhatmakan Kaman, Veda Dukkhatmakan Kam, Parityagepya Nishwaraha, Parityagepya Nishwaraha. Jata Shraddhaha Matkatasu. Matkatasu. When you listen to the stories of Sri Krishna, he's used this expression before, and he's saying, suppose you just happen to hear these stories of Sri Krishna and they capture your imagination, they capture your heart. So suppose, by the way, that's obviously not for everyone, but that's who he's addressing right now. Suppose, having heard these stories about Sri Krishna, he uses the pronoun mat, me. Suppose someone having heard these stories about me, jata shraddhaha, in that person, faith and devotion are kindled. So for that person, which means, we said according to this principle of adhikara bheda, there are some who are, really funny American expression, when you say you are wired for something, referring to the wiring of the so-called neural networks in our minds. Wired for something means predisposed towards something. So suppose you are wired for or predisposed towards jnana. That's some people, but Sri Krishna is not addressing those people right now. He's talking about those who are jata shraddha, those people who have this faith and devotion kindled. What about them? He says, skip down in the third line. He says, when those people, Veda, when they understand what? Kaman, when they understand worldly desires to be dukkhatmakan, to result in suffering. Worldly desires end in suffering for a lot of different reasons. First of all, any worldly enjoyment you go after, how long do you enjoy it? Right? And that's problem number one. Problem number two is, how much did you have to spend to enjoy it? Problem number two. Problem number three, while you're busy enjoying it, what happened to your path of spiritual growth? So at least these three problems associated with fulfilling worldly desires. So Veda, when a person understands that these worldly desires end up causing suffering. And he goes on to say, for that person who parityage api anishvaraha. Api, even, I'm breaking the words up, by the way. Api, even though that person is anishvaraha, in this context, unable to do what? Parityage, to come out of those desires. Even if a person, these two lines together, if a person whose, actually 3 lines together, if a person whose faith and devotion has been kindled, if that person understands that pursuing worldly desires will result in sorrow and suffering, but suppose that person is anishvaraha, unable to come out of that we just finished the season of Deepavali, lots of social events. And people say, oh, I'm on a spiritual path, I'm not into all these social events. But they go anyway. And why not? That's the point. I mean, it's for a religious purpose, ends up being more social. The focus is on chit-chat and food, of course. That's normal. But in spiritual life, you can do better than that. It's normal. And the idea here is, in spiritual life, we can do better than that, but it takes time. And that's what Sri Krishna is describing here. So suppose you are jata shraddha, your faith and devotion has been kindled, but you still enjoy going to these social gatherings. Then what? And you can't, and even though you are on a spiritual path, you still feel strongly inclined to go to these things. Sri Krishna says, don't worry about it. Eventually, in the line we skipped before, eventually, nirvinnaha sarva karmasu. Eventually, you will become disillusioned. Eventually. And it'll take its own time. And let me stress this point a little bit. If you were to say, and I don't mean you in a particular way, if somebody were to say, I'm a spiritual person, I'm not going to go to this social gathering. And then tomorrow your friend says, oh, it was such a wonderful gathering. You should have been there. And you feel really sad because you missed out. Okay. Sri Krishna says, go to those social gatherings. If you have that desire to keep going to those social gatherings, go. But he says, eventually you will become nirvinnaha, disillusioned. Eventually it'll become boring. Just naturally. The point is, you don't have to willfully withdraw from those worldly activities. In fact, when you are sufficiently mature, those activities will go away from you. You don't go away from the activities go away from you. That's how I ended up like this. Everything went away. There is nothing left. But the point I'm making, it's natural. It's completely, there was never a day when I decided, oh, I'm going to give this up, oh, I'm going to give that up. I simply wasn't, there were things I used to be attracted to, and then later I wasn't attracted to them. That's a natural process of spiritual growth and a process that you're all engaged in, and just be patient, let it work its way through. You will arrive at that point where you too are nirvinnaha sarva karmasu. Karmasu. You are disillusioned with all that worldly stuff. Then, tato bhajeta mam pritaha, tato bhajeta mam pritaha, shraddhalur dridha nishchayaha, shraddhalur dridha nishchayaha, jushamanashchatan kaman, jushamanashchatan kaman, duhkodarkan chagarhayan, duhkodarkan chagarhayan. Tataha, thereafter, then. So then meaning after you are jata shraddha, after your faith has been kindled, tataha, then bhajeta, then you should worship Mam, Sri Krishna says. It would be, I think, suppose someone says, Swamiji, isn't that sectarian? We are reading the Bhagavata Purana. And, to call it sectarian is superimposing a Western kind of bias. No, it would be sectarian if the Bhagavata Purana says you should only study the Bhagavata Purana. You shouldn't study anything else. You shouldn't worship Shiva. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do that. That would be sectarian. And no doubt there is such a thing as sectarianism in the Hindu tradition. This is not sectarian because Sri Krishna says bhajeta mam, you should worship me. Who should worship me? Jata Shraddha, one who has faith in Sri Krishna should worship Sri Krishna. Make sense? Not sectarian. Some people like to look for, I mentioned before, some people like to look for problems. That they read a book looking for the typos. Useless. And in the same way, some people study scripture in the same way, or read scriptures in the same way, looking for what's wrong. Not helpful. Okay, so this is not really sectarian, but rather talking about one who is pritaha, one who is devoted to Sri Krishna, one who is shraddhaluhu, full of faith and devotion, one who is dridha nishchayaha, one who is firmly committed to that practice of bhakti. And what about that person? Jushamanaha. That person's practice thrives. Thrives how? And this is now the connection to the prior verse. That person's practice thrives how? Last word, garhayan. When that person, what is a nice translation? The standard translation is cursing. I don't think that's an appropriate translation here. Rejecting is my own translation. That's good. When that person rejects tan kaman, all of those desires we spoke about in the prior verse, those desires which are dukkha udarkan, those desires which culminate in suffering, dukkha. So here he's restating that process, that withdrawal from ordinary worldly activities happens gradually while you are engaged in your main spiritual practice. Meaning, and here's something you may not have thought about, it's not a linear process. Linear process is like a cookbook. Step A, do this. Step B, do that. Step C, do this. So to turn this into cookbook, step A is see the futility of gaining perfect contentment through worldly activities. Step B is get engaged in an authentic spiritual practice. Notice there's a sequence there if we turn them into steps. These aren't steps. This is not a linear process. This isn't a cookbook kind of practice. Everything is done in parallel, simultaneously. And there's a nice thing that takes place, a fancy word that somebody used or made up, synergy. When certain things are done at the same time, they enhance each other, which means your spiritual practice enhances your withdrawal from non-spiritual things, and your withdrawal from non-spiritual things enhances your spiritual practice. That's what's called synergy. Then, good. I'm going to come to the crowning point of this. We have 2 more verses, and we'll see that. Proktena bhakti yogena, proktena bhakti yogena, bhajato masakrin munehe, bhajato masakrit munehe, kama hridya nashyan, kama hridaya nashyanti, kama hridaya nashyanti, sarve mai hridi sthite, sarve mai hridi sthite. Proktena bhakti yogena, through the practice of bhakti, as Sri Krishna described in a prior verse, where he says, bhajeta mam, worship me, where he says, shraddhaluhu, be full of faith and devotion, be dhrida nishchayaha, be devoted to this practice, be jushamanaha, be engaged in enhancing, furthering your practice. He says in proktena bhakti yogena, through all of that, bhajataha munehe. Muni is a word for a sage. And he used before the word yogi. And he's, we do, I'm smiling because we do this in day-to-day life, where you praise, if you want someone to understand you, you encourage them. You don't put them down. You don't say, you don't understand anything. The moment you say that, you don't understand anything, what happens to their mind? Shut, tight, which means they're not going to hear anything that you say from that point onwards. They stop listening. So if you want someone to really understand, you treat that person with respect. And here, in Sri Krishna's discussion with Uddhava, he previously said yogi. He's talking to Uddhava, and he is giving Uddhava the status figuratively of a yogi, and now muni. Muni means sage. So these words refer to any sincere spiritual practitioner, and not just Uddhava, it includes all of you. Okay, so that bhajataha munehe, for a sincere spiritual practitioner who is bhajataha, worshiping who? Ma means mom, me, worshiping Sri Krishna, asakrit, not just once, he says continuously, continually worshiping Sri Krishna. What about that person? Kamaha, hridayaha, the desires of one's heart, nashyanti, get destroyed. So here's the idea. How to overcome desire to these worldly activities. And Sri Krishna's message is, don't worry about it. Just go on worshiping me. Go on with your main spiritual practice, and in time, all of these other things will just fall away from you. Instead of giving them up, they go away from you. Just a quick anecdote, because it really makes a point. I was raised in this country I was raised going to McDonald's. You bet. I ate lots of McDonald's burgers and fries and all of that stuff as a child growing up. Then as a young adult, I started practicing yoga and meditation. And I started noticing that whatever I ate seemed to affect my meditation, especially eating all this McDonald's stuff. By the way, it's also bad for your health, but that's another thing. Fast food is not that healthy. But the point I'm making is I became vegetarian not because one day I decided to. I became vegetarian because non-veg food went away from me. I found it not appealing anymore. And I think that's really important because, many people, like in fact when I was young, that we're idealistic. And idealistic means we have high expectations for ourselves. And with those high expectations, we may make decisions in life that we're not ready for. And a very common scenario in India is someone who takes sannyasa prematurely. That happens a lot. They're very, very devoted, honest, sincere, but not mature enough. And so that person will take sannyasa, renounce worldly activities prematurely, and end up suffering as a result. So I met many, especially young male sannyasis, who were conflicted about their life of sannyasa. So the point we're making here is not to willfully renounce these worldly activities which become obstacles to spiritual growth. That's very important to add in here. The goal is not to renounce all. Tell me, is eating food a worldly activity? Yeah. Best not to renounce all normal worldly activities, but only those which interfere with your spiritual practice, which is why I took to a vegetarian diet. So he says here, the point here is instead of willfully renouncing worldly activities that are obstructions to spiritual practice, you continue with your spiritual practice and you'll discover that those obstacles go away gradually on their own. You don't need to willfully push them away. And then how does that happen? It happens when, and this is lovely how Sri Krishna says this at the end of the verse. He says, when sarve mayi hridi sthite. Sarve sthite hridi mayi. He says, things go away when sarve sthite, when everything that you consider to be a source of pleasure, when all of that is hridi, in one's heart, which is where mayi, where Sri Krishna abides, where I abide. That's a little poetic. Let me explain it. Distracting worldly activities draw you because they seem to be a source of happiness. Like the party example. And again, nothing wrong with going to social functions. So, suppose you are drawn to those social functions because it's a lot of fun. Suppose you discover that you like prayer, meditation, spiritual study suppose that brings you even more contentment, peace, and joy than going to parties. Then what? That's it. When you discover, and to paraphrase what Sri Krishna says in his last line, he says, when you discover my presence in your own heart, why will you even bother chasing after all these worldly enjoyments? The worldly enjoyments will eventually pale in comparison with the joy and contentment you find in Sri Krishna's presence in your own heart. And this is he says it so nicely, this is a culmination of the spiritual practice. He says you don't have to run away or push away all these worldly activities which are impediments to your spiritual growth. You continue your spiritual pursuit until you discover me in your heart, and to the extent you discover Sri Krishna's presence within you, to that extent you lose your, the Sanskrit ruchi, your taste, your I don't know, some words don't translate. The attractiveness of all these worldly activities fades away. That's where the expression comes. Pales in comparison. It's like a flower fades, then it's a faded flower. Everything in the world becomes like faded flowers, which means flowers are wonderful, but if they're faded, they're just not so attractive, is the point. So in this way, everything in the world becomes less attractive when you discover Sri Krishna's presence in your heart. And then he concludes in a very powerful way by quoting a great rishi whose works are recorded in the Mundaka Upanishad. Sri Krishna here quotes, Bhidyate hridaya grantish, Bhidyate hridaya grantish, Chidyante sarva samshayaha, Chidyante sarva samshayaha, Kshiyante chasya karmani, Kshiyante chasya karmani, Mai drishte khilatmani, Mai drishte khilatmani. So Sri Krishna here, in the first three lines, are a direct quote of this rishi, this famous verse in the Mundaka Upanishad, where the rishi describes the state of enlightenment. And he describes it as the state in which bhidyate hridaya grantihi, the state where the granti means knot. Hridaya granti, the knot of the heart, is a very poetic way of describing ignorance. It means ignorance. Hridaya granti means ignorance. In particular, ignorance of Sri Krishna's presence in your own heart. Already present, but not yet discovered. Remember, we said that the path of jnana and the path of bhakti arrive at the same point. The path of jnana arrives at the point of recognizing your true nature, that inner divinity, and you've heard me comment about this before. It's not that you become divine, you've always been that divine being, but you've been so identified with your body and mind, you have not yet fully recognized your true nature as that divinity within. So that divinity within, then Sri Krishna, if Sri Krishna were sitting here, he's standing there. If he could talk, he would say, he would add on to what I just said. He says, yes, and I am that Atma who dwells within you as Satchidananda Atma. I dwell in you as your true nature. This is the idea, as we've said before. So in this way, bhidyate, though knots of the heart. The knot of the heart, meaning the ignorance which prevents you from discovering your true nature. Alternatively, the ignorance which prevents you from discovering Lord Krishna's presence within you. He says that ignorance, vidyate, is cut away. Also, sarva samshayaha, all doubts, all confusion, all conflict, chidyante, they are all removed, all cut away, all doubts are removed. Finally, asya karmani, and for that person, all that person's karmani, actions that need to be performed for the sake of happiness. This is why you can't just read a text. I mean, if you just read, all that person's actions stop. What does that mean? For that person, all actions come to an end. What does that mean? The words aren't enough. We have to fill in the gaps. And filling in the gaps for that person, for that enlightened person, the need to be engaged in worldly activities for the sake of fulfilling worldly desires comes to an end. That's what it means. So here he quotes from this Mundaka Upanishad to describe the state of enlightenment, discovering one's true nature as Satchidananda Atma, to which Sri Krishna says, and I am that Satchidananda Atma, who is your true nature. And that's exactly what he says in the last line here. He says, Mayi drishte akila atmani, Mayi drishte. When I am discovered, Atmani, as one's true self, not just one's true self, Akila Atmani, as the self of all. When I am discovered as the self of all, then that's it. Some of you would say, Bas sab kaam ho gaya. All the work is done. All the work meaning that compulsion driven by discontentment. When you feel that sense of not being satisfied, and then wanting something more to be satisfied, and then wanting something more and something more and something more. When does that satiation come? Through worldly activities, it never comes. You will never find perfect peace and contentment, satiation, through the pursuit of worldly pleasures. On the other hand, Sri Krishna says, when you discover my presence within you as your true nature, then you have this perfect satiation, perfect contentment, perfect peace. This is the conclusion he makes. This is enlightenment. And just to loop back to our beginning of the class, notice that he's described the path of bhakti leading to the same recognition that the path of jnana leads to. In language is a little different. Path of jnana says you recognize your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. The bhakti languages, you recognize your true nature as Sri Krishna's presence within you. But they both arrive at exactly the same place, exactly the same goal. This is a good place to conclude for today. Tomorrow, Sunday, we have our Vedanta class, Upadesha Sahasri at 10 o'clock, and more in-depth teachings, and then followed by satsang at 11. Come with your questions, and we'll conclude with our prayers. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shranvan Uttabasira Saranam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.